the other week when we were talking about the social construction of race and ethnicity, I had an example that I had to cut for time that was meant to show another way outside of formal governmental systems that we can see the enduring cultural importance of whiteness and some ways in which race is still salient in our lives today. And as we are getting ready to turn to looking at racial inequalities and thinking about racial inequalities more systemically, I think it's good to return to that case study and show some of the ways that it demonstrates this link between culture and structural inequalities and some of the broader enduring questions about race. In August of 2017, a rally in Charlottesville, Virginia turned violent when a rally participant drove his car into a group of counter-protesters, killing 1 and injuring 20. This is in addition to the rather disturbing images many of you have probably seen. The rally itself included chants like, "Jews will not replace us," and "End immigration, one people, one nation." The rally was even organized by people self-described as white nationalists. While the entire event is deplorable and the deadly outcome has been rightly called an act of domestic terrorism, it is both dangerous and inaccurate to write this off as simply a case of fringe or extremist politics. In at least 2 ways, the events in Charlottesville show us how our broader culture still treats whiteness as more desirable and more important than other racial identities. The first example can be seen in the actions of the marchers themselves. In similar sorts of rallies in the past, marchers wore hoods over their faces. In Charlottesville, there was no attempt to mask or hide identities. In fact, many photographed participants appeared to be smug or even unashamed. The main reason for this is an effort by movement leaders to shift the broader conversation and make racially exclusionary views palatable. Richard Spencer, one of the rally's organizers, has been explicit on this point. First, he coined the term alt-right for use for expressing white nationalist and supremacist views. Alt-right sounds significantly more benign and moderate than either of these other phrases. Second, in an interview with The Atlantic in late 2016, he described how he was working to move such views further into the mainstream. He said, quote, "If you greeted someone in 1985 and you said all gays should marry, you actually would get a lot of laughs. By 2015, gay marriage is popular. What is possible has shifted. That's what the alt-right is doing. It's shifting the reality of what's possible." End quote. Not only is this a clear example of an attempt to shift how we socially construct reality, these efforts have been at least somewhat successful. But we can get a better glimpse of how this links to broader cultural norms by exploring what prompted the rally in the first place. The Unite the Right rally, as it was called, was initially meant to be a protest of the University of Virginia's plan to remove a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. And if we think about the incredible endurance of Confederate monuments and the resistance generated by their proposed removal, we can see clearly how such symbols reify whiteness as a hegemonic ideal, both institutionally and culturally. Now, I recognize this is a dangerous topic. The general contours of the debate are that, on the one hand, Confederate symbols are about Southern heritage and culture, or on the other hand, that they represent white supremacy and a heritage of slavery. In a very simplified way, both of these views are right. That Southern heritage and culture actually is about white supremacy. I also recognize I may have just lost some of you. Even though I'm about to lay out a string of compelling historical facts, the true power of culture and the social construction of meaning are such that sometimes this can override even objective truths. Nonetheless, these are important lessons to know, because as defenders of such symbols would argue, we really do need to better understand our history. So, how do Confederate symbols show the enduring importance of whiteness? Very few monuments went up immediately after the Civil War, though everyone at the time understandably mourned their dead, regardless of which side of that war they fought on. Let's consider as a case study North Carolina. Fewer than 30 memorials went up between 1865 and 1890. But in the next half century, more than 130 were erected. Most Confederate monuments were erected at times when the South was fighting to resist political rights for black citizens, and especially as Jim Crow was put in place. Such monuments were attempts to promote white cultural unity that didn't exist prior to or during the war. Note that there were no statues of those white Southerners who fought for the Union or who actively opposed the Confederacy, and there were certainly none of the African Americans who escaped slavery and joined the Union Army. Some of these monuments were even explicitly linked to the cause of white supremacy at their installation. During a 1913 dedication of one such monument at UNC, one speaker urged his audience to devote themselves to the maintenance of white supremacy with the same vigor that their Confederate ancestors had defended slavery. And he praised Confederate soldiers for their defense, quote, of the Anglo-Saxon race during the 4 years after the war, end quote. This, by the way, was a reference to the rise of the KKK. Most of these monuments were the result of private groups colonizing public space. They were funded by United Daughters of the Confederacy and similar groups, and few went through the approval procedures we now commonly apply to public art. Of the few that went up with public funding, we must also remember that such budget allocations did not represent the will of all residents. Most black citizens at those times were denied the right to vote by Jim Crow laws and had no say in how their tax dollars were spent. We can even turn to the clearest symbol of the Confederacy, its flag. Unlike statues, the flag was created during the Civil War. In an editorial in April of 1863, the flag's creator was explicit in his racist ideologies. He said, "As a people, we are fighting to maintain the heavenly ordained supremacy of the white man over the inferior or colored race. A white flag would thus be emblematic of our cause. Such a flag would be a suitable emblem of our young Confederacy, and sustained by the brave hearts and strong arms of the South, it would soon take rank among the proudest ensigns of the nation, and be hailed by the civilized world as the white man's flag." Though data are limited, some surveys have shown that Southerners who support the Confederate flag are less knowledgeable about Southern history, less tolerant of interracial dating, and more likely to deny that blacks face discrimination today. Now, the first of those on that list is especially striking considering that a common argument in support of displaying this flag is that it is a symbol of heritage, not hate. Were that the case, we might expect such supporters would be more aware of the very heritage they claim to promote. Perhaps the most relevant factoid in this regard being the reason for state secession in the first place. Yes, the reason for the Civil War was an argument over states' rights. A state's right to maintain the institution of slavery. It was an argument over a state's right as to whether or not certain individuals could be legally classified as property of other individuals. In their articles of secession, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, Texas, and Virginia all explicitly stated that the ability to maintain the institution of slavery in their respective territory was the primary factor in their decision to leave the Union. Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, said in a speech in March of 1861 that slavery was the immediate cause of the late rupture and the present revolution of Southern independence. In contrast to the words of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, Stephens said in contrast that, quote, "Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rest upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition." End quote. It is hard to find more compelling evidence that among the many competing meanings behind Confederate symbols, they were founded upon, and at least indirectly celebrate, a position of whiteness as the most desirable racial group. And we can see elements of this hearkening even into today, as seen, for example, in August of 2016 in the events that went down in Charlottesville, Virginia.